Okay, we are at week 6. I'm finally getting Mennonites and Amish to North America after 5 weeks of the sojourn through church history. There's my clicker. At the end of each session, I've had some really interesting conversations with people about things that I talked about. And I just want to mention 3 from last time, 2 weeks ago. Norman and somebody else came up to me and said, you know, in Nebraska, we do something similar to what those people, those Amish near Bern did. I showed a picture of Amish people buried in a cemetery, not by family order, but by order of death. So the person that died yesterday is buried there, the person that died today is buried here, and the person that's buried tomorrow, dies tomorrow, will be buried there. Anyway, it was an image of community superseding individuals. 2 people came to me and said, in Nebraska, they do that among Mennonites. I didn't know that Mennonites bury according to date of death, not by family grouping. I'm sure there are other groups that emphasize community over individual. Interesting. Someone asked about the Holdeman Mennonites, and someone asked about the Old Order Mennonites, both of whom people have met on their travels, very briefly. Yeah. Well, it was your sister who asked about it. And she told me on a trip one time you met some of these Holdemans. Okay, well. The Holdemans come from this man, John Holdeman, who broke away from the Mennonites in Wayne County, Ohio in 1859. They're plain. They look very similar to other plain groups. Their distinctive is that they believe they are the one true church. You go back to the Anabaptist, before that to the Waldensians. Remember I talked about Peter Waldo from the 12th century early on in my presentations. Well, they say Waldo is linked to earlier marginal groups, probably monastic groups, going back to the early church. They are the one true church in this lineage going back to the early church. They are very evangelical. They have been evangelical since the beginning. Holdeman himself was an evangelist. There are about 20,000 of them in the US and Canada at this point in time. The other group that someone asked about were the Old Order Mennonites. These are the horse and buggy driving Mennonites who have no historical connection to the Amish, but they, to this day, drive horse and buggies, use steel-wheeled tractors, etc. They have their origins in Pennsylvania and Indiana. A man by the name of Whistler was a minister in Indiana, and he wanted to preserve traditional ideas. He opposed 4-part singing. He opposed audible prayer instead of silent prayer at the beginning of church. He just didn't want these changes that were coming along. The last straw, as I say here, was when he refused to accept Sunday school. Indiana-Michigan Conference said, we're going to start doing Sunday school. He said no. He was excommunicated by John F. Funk, the important publisher in Mennonite history, and Daniel Brenneman. His group became the Whistler Mennonites. Some people know them as the Black Bumper Mennonites. To this day, they do not have chrome on their cars. In 1907, in Indiana, there was a breakaway from the Whistlers over the issue of the car and telephone. A group that said we're not going to accept the telephone, we're not going to accept the car, became the Old Order Mennonites. The Old Order Mennonites have this conference now, the Gruffdale Conference. Its largest concentrations are in Pennsylvania and Indiana. They still use horse and buggy. They use steel wheels in their tractors. They have telephones and electricity in their homes, with the exception of their ministers. Ministers are not allowed to have telephones in their homes. There is one community in Iowa. It started in 1992. It's between Charles and Mason City. Okay, that was an aside. Now we come to the main story today, and that is the migration to North America and some of the divisions that occurred among Amish and Mennonites as they came here. We know that in the early 1600s, there were already individual Mennonites coming to North America. They came as part of the Dutch migration to New Amsterdam, which we now know as New York City. There was a carpenter who's listed in the ledger of the city of New Amsterdam, New York City, Peter Peterson. He owned a part of the land in what is now known as Manhattan. There are other Mennists listed in other documents of the time. The first group, however, came to Delaware. Lewes, Delaware is a town at the entrance of the Delaware from the Atlantic Ocean inland. There's this city called Lewes. In July of 1663, a ship landed there with a group of Dutch Mennonites. Their leader was Plockhoy, rather. He'd spent time in England, was advocating communal living. He said the Hutterites are a model of what we want to do, but he wanted to create a kind of community where the poor would have a base. They would share the goods. This community would share their goods with the poor. They would meet their military obligations by a special tax rather than serving. They would have religious freedom. Not have anything to do with slavery. The Dutch government helped support this movement of 25 families to the New World. Well, that experiment barely lasted 2 years. The English and the Dutch were fighting over the New World. English troops plundered this settlement, destroyed it. The village disappeared. Everybody but Plockhoy and his wife left the Mennonite church. Plockhoy made his way to Germantown, Philadelphia, where he was part of that community. The bigger story is the story of William Penn and Penn's Sylvania. Penn's father had somehow lent a lot of money to King Charles II of England, and the way Charles paid Penn back for his father's debt was to give him a big parcel of land in the New World. Penn wanted to use this land to provide a refuge for people in Europe who were persecuted. He was a Quaker himself. He knew of the Mennonites in Germany and the Netherlands. He actually went on a tour in Europe, meeting these people, these persecuted people in Europe. He traveled with George Fox. Of course, George Fox was the founder of the Quakers. So there was this linkage between Quakers and Mennonites early on. He went, among other places, to Krefeld. Krefeld is this community way in the north here. We've been talking about the Swiss Brethren down here and the Amish division here. Up here is the other center of Anabaptism, the Netherlands. And there's a German group that's very close. The Krefeld community is very close to this Dutch Mennonite center. And these Krefeld people came to North America in a group. They came in 1682. A man, two people actually, purchased 5,000 acres in what is now Pennsylvania. A year later, families started coming across the Atlantic. By 1685, 8,000 people from that area in North Germany known as Krefeld arrived in the US. In the early years of their existence in this country, they aligned with the other German-speaking groups, and English, the Quakers. By 1698, they initially worshiped together with these other groups, including Quakers, Lutherans, and other Reformed. But they decided by 1689 it's time to separate. They asked the church, they didn't have a minister. They asked the church in Europe, send us ministers. And the church in Europe said, no, do what we've always done. Find leaders within your own group. Use the lot. And they chose William Rettenhouse to be their first preacher, John Noyce, or Nice, to be their first deacon. Rittenhouse was not well. In fact, he was a sick man throughout most of this period. He never preached extemporaneously, meaning he didn't preach like Joel did this morning. He read sermons. They selected their first active bishop, Jacob Gottschalk, whom I'm a direct descendant from, in 1702. He performed the first baptisms, first communion service, etc. In 1708, they built their first meeting houses. And within a few years, they started moving up the creeks, the streams, the Schuylkill, the Wissahickon, and others, and then later moved on to Lancaster, where Penn gave the Mennonites some land along Peckaway Creek. Well, two comments before I move on to these influences. History always has a context. There's always something going on behind the scene that affects specific events. Two things that I would point to that are very important contextual issues behind the scenes in the story that I'm going to get into. Two things to keep in mind about modernity are the impact of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. You know this philosopher, René Descartes. He was a mathematician, the father of modern philosophy. He has this famous line, "I think, therefore I am." He was profoundly impacted by the Enlightenment, the age of reason, age of the individual thinking for themselves. He made this statement, "I know that I exist because I think." That's a profoundly modern way of thinking about an individual. Throughout most of human history, throughout most of traditional societies to this day, I belong, therefore I exist. I belong to a human group, therefore I exist. How do I know I belong? You tell me I belong. I don't stand alone as an individual and say, "I think, therefore I am." That's a very modern way of seeing the world. That idea of individualism, individual rational thought, is extremely important in the story we're going to look at. The second image is the image of the factory. Throughout most of human history, people made the whole widget, not just one piece of the widget, and put those pieces together in a factory to produce widgets. The automobile factory is the prime example. Create tires someplace, you create carburetors some other place, you create transmissions, bring them all together in a building and an assembly line, and you efficiently, rationally put the car together. Okay, now to come back to this. Three other influences that are important to know about in this story: Pietism, German culture, and humility. Mennonites were heavily influenced by Pietism. The Pietists in Europe, they are the people for whom the Church of the Brethren comes from. Alexander Mack brought them here. Pietists sought a personally meaningful religious experience. They put a lot of weight on theology. They said they believed according to the Bible, but they were interested in this inner life of the believer. Mennonites were also interested in this inner life, but Mennonites had this issue of there has to be an outward manifestation of the inner life. There has to be an obedience to Christ, which can lead to suffering. There were significant differences, therefore, between Pietists in Europe. They stayed with the state church. Between Pietists and Mennonites, the Pietists stayed with the state church. They continued to baptize infants. We know that when the Church of the Brethren came here, they rejected both of those and became pacifists. So Pietism is in the background, this emphasis on inner experience. And then there's German culture. Eastern Pennsylvania was a bastion of German culture from the 1700s to the 20th century. Baron Schlabach, historian at Goshen College, says that Mennonites lived in the womb of Pennsylvania Germans. There were the church people, the Lutherans and Reformed, the sectarians, Mennonites, Dunkers, and Amish, and eventually the revivalists, known as the Methodists. Religiously, they shared this language of Pietism. Sometimes they shared pulpits, especially at funerals. The schools of the time taught the language, the outlook of pietism. Intermarriage occurred in those days. In daily life, Mennonites and Amish constantly mixed with their neighbors in mills, distilleries, markets, and shops. The third issue is humility. And this is the break away from this individualism that I'm talking about. Revivalism is strongly individualistic in nature. When you have a revival where you call people down and the individual confesses their sin, there's a strong emphasis on individualism. More specifically, the focus is on repentance by the individual, yielding to God in a new relationship between himself and God. Mennonites reacted against that and said this singular focus on the individual and his or her inner life is not all of the story. Rather than boasting about one's salvation, they preferred practical evidence in one's life, one's relationship to God that reflected humility in dress, work, household furnishings, etc. There's a Franconia Mennonite bishop, Eastern Pennsylvania bishop, who said during the colonial era publication something that reflects this thinking. He asked why non-resistant Christians were no longer suffering. His answer? They should live more humbly. Quit striving for political power and other forms of status. Inevitably, they would clash with the world and suffering will return. A Lancaster bishop in an address to the youth. He resisted the idea of public testimonies and all tendency to measure new birth and conversion by inner subjective experience. Burkholder said evidence for the new birth was a shift from pride, individual pride, to humility. The emphasis on humility put Mennonites somewhat at odds with their neighbors. They appreciated the freedom, the security that they'd gotten in the New World, but there was some discomfort with the national mood. There was little outright persecution. Their humility outlet, however, was at odds with much of American religion, which focused on individualism and nationalism. In the 19th century, they became the quiet in the land. Well, Mennonites and Amish began to spread out from Pennsylvania, initially to other parts of Pennsylvania, but by the 1700s, they were in Virginia, Maryland, and Ontario. This group of Mennonites that go from Franconia Conference up into Ontario already in the 1700s. By 1799, they're in Ohio. 1830s and 40s, they're in Illinois and here. By 1870s to Kansas and later further west. Most of these people are from Swiss German background, South German background. The Mennonites, the Russian Mennonite story, which I'll talk about next week, comes later. Well, I want to talk about two significant divisions, one among the Mennonites and one among the Amish, that are with us to this day, I think. In the 19th century, there were many changes going on in the broader church, in the broader Christian church, which is part of this modernity emphasis, the rational approach to faith. Sunday schools were being advocated, music, musical notation, four-part singing. Ministry, people were beginning to say, requires some formal training. There are 516 colleges developed in this country before the Civil War, and almost all of them were religious training grounds for ministry. Churches organize, this is the larger church, not Mennonites in particular. Churches should organize into congregations, conferences, denominations. The missions emphasis starts, first with home missions and later foreign missions. All that is going on with the modernization of the church in North America. Well, in that context, there are two divisions, one Mennonite, one Amish. The Oberholzer division of Eastern Pennsylvania eventually led to the formation of the General Conference. The annual ministers' meetings that occurred between 1862 and 1878 among the Amish led to the split between the Old Order and the Amish Mennonites. And this church, of course, comes out of the Amish Mennonite stream. John Oberholzer was a teacher, minister in the Swamp congregation in the Franconia area. He refused to wear a plain coat when he was ordained. Strongly individualistic statement. I won't wear a plain coat. He advocated minutes. We have annual meetings, you need to have minutes. Furthermore, we need a constitution. Well, all that is modern thinking. All three were an affront to tradition. To the modern mind, reason or rational thinking are the preferred ways of approaching any issue. Within formal organizations, we do things. That's the efficient way to organize human beings. The individual and most of all of his or her rights are paramount. Well, Oberholzer had logical reason for all the things he did. He was exercising free will. In the Age of Enlightenment, he said, we need a rational organization, we need minutes, we need a constitution. In a letter, John Ruth wrote a history of the Franconia Conference, and here's an ally of Oberholzer writing in favor of Oberholzer's ideas. And in the first couple of sentences, he talks about tradition being antiquated. It's time to give due role to faculty of thought, the privilege of reason. And you can read, he goes on to make a case for modernity. Oberholzer is right. I won't read that, you can. It's in the book, Maintaining the Right Fellowship by John Ruth. Steve Wood. Why would they not see the modernization in church life was not a matter of fancy or mere utility, but necessity? Ruth's analysis of this situation, what became the Oberholzer division, was that we have two models of church among the Mennonites in the 19th century. The newer one had rationality, democracy, clarity on its side, as well as a new definition of piety. The traditional one represented the submission of the individual, even when it might be more enlightened, to the authority of the larger brotherhood. Mutual surrender was key to their self-understanding. The more conservative group said, yielding to the group was more important than the individual stepping outside of the group and exercising his or her own rights. The Oberholzer division in eastern Pennsylvania led to the creation of the General Conference of the Mennonite Church. Oberholzer joined with two churches here in Iowa, down near West Point, who had a conversation with him in 1853, had a meeting in 1859, and the primary goal was to form a missionary society to promote unity, evangelism, and the need for a stronger education program. 10 years later, there were 20 congregations who were part of the General Conference, about 1,500 people. The big influx for the General Conference came with the Russian Mennonites in the 1870s. We'll talk about that next time. So we have a General Conference. I grew up with the phrase New Mennonites. I never heard that label, General Conference, until I went to Goshen College. We talked about the New Mennonites and the Old Mennonites. We were Old Mennonites. Those people are New Mennonites. The Deep Run Church is on the edge of Franconia Conference. The church my father grew up in was the Old Mennonite Church. The New Mennonites, the General Conference people, said, you know, you have church every other Sunday. Let us use your church on the off Sunday. The Old Mennonite Church said, no, you can't use it. So what did they do? The New Mennonites went down the road less than a half a mile away and built their own church. And to this day, there are two churches within a half a mile of each other, both Mennonite, one General Conference, one Old Mennonite, one New Mennonite, one Old Mennonite. As a child, I heard about those New Mennonites. The women wore hats instead of coverings to church. The men came out and smoked. There were all these ideas about those people are different than us. Okay. Let's go on to the ministers' meeting among the Amish. There was a lot of conflict, not only among Mennonites, but conflict in the Mennonite church about the same issues related to modernity. Part of the issue that we're dealing with here is different waves of migration. There were Amish who came in the 1700s, there were Amish who came in the 1800s, and those more recent immigrants from Europe didn't always agree with the Amish who came earlier. That's part of the issue. But they were arguing about the issue of having church buildings or not. They were arguing about baptism in a stream versus pouring, using buttons instead of hooks and eyes, the use of four-part singing, and so on. For 16 years, there were meetings of Amish ministers that were brought together from all over the United States to a barn to discuss these changes. These meetings all focused on Ordnung. Ordnung is the word that Amish people use for the rules of the church, the rules that dictate how you're supposed to live, how to maintain order in the church. Over time, these meetings led to a split. A progressive group emerged, and a more tradition-oriented group that we know to this day as the Old Order emerged. The Old Order wanted to preserve the old ways of doing things. The former wanted the church to change. The Old Order wanted church to be local, small scale, without meeting houses. They rejected the idea of having denominational structures, church-wide structures. They didn't like the idea of salaried ministers. An Amish bishop once told me, I went to his house, and there was this vicious dog out front. And I hadn't seen many vicious dogs in Amish homes, but the dog was there, and I had to go by him to get in the house. And he said, your ministers, meaning salaried ministers, are like that dog. That dog knows where the end of the chain is. Your ministers know the limits to which they can go because they're paid by their congregation. So they were opposed to salaried ministers. They were opposed to revival meetings, Sunday schools, English language services. In June of 1862, these meetings began. 72 ministers met in Samuel Schrock's barn in Smithville, Ohio, to begin the conversation. They were trying to organize a nationwide Amish fellowship with rules that were similar across all these churches. About a third of the original participants were conservative and 2/3 were change-minded. Rather than bringing unity to the Amish church, these meetings led to a clear schism between the progressive Amish Mennonites and the conservative Old Order Amish, and that split was irreparable. And you know that this church came out of that. I was going to ask someone, and I forgot to ask, how do you pronounce W-E-R-E-Y? First minister. Wherey. I always want to say Wherey, and people have told me that's wrong. Wherey, okay. So you know this story of Christian Wherey coming from Indiana. He was actually ordained in Indiana, and he was part of a change-minded group, Amish Mennonite group. He moved to Iowa and thinks he's going to go back to the old order. Well, you know the story. He said, being a good modern person using his rational free will powers, I have the right to have a top on my buggy. I have a right to wear a raincoat when it rains. And the other ministers said, no, you're not going to preach in our churches unless you give up those things. He said no, being a good modern person, and he never preached in the old order. He was ordained as an Amish Mennonite bishop in Illinois and Indiana, not here, and was instrumental in the Amish Mennonite tradition here. That tension persisted into the 20th century. The Amish church in Johnson County had to face the issue of the telephone. And there was a real conflict. The question of whether to adopt the telephone was put to a vote in the Amish district here before communion. 2 weeks before communion, in every Amish community, there has to be this ordinance-made, this discussion of the rules. Well, they had a vote. Bishop John F. Schwarzentrober, well, the key point there is some of the men in the church voted yes, we want telephones. All the women voted no, we don't want telephones. Bishop John F. Schwarzentrober, who opposed telephones, telephones, declared that the majority had spoken and we're not going to have telephones. Really interesting. That decision produced anything but peace. And a number of change-minded households in which husbands apparently overruled their wives led to a progressive Amish Mennonite church. Change continued in the new group, in this Amish Mennonite group. The Amish method of reading from a specifically prescribed set of scriptures was replaced by ministers choosing their own text. Fast singing replaced the singing from the Ausbund. If you've heard Amish singing, it is so distinctly different. I discreetly use my watch when I'm sitting in an Amish service. Locally, the second song that's always sung in an Amish church service, this is 4 verses, fastest I've ever heard it sung is 15 minutes. I've heard it sung as slow as 24 minutes for 4 verses. That old way of singing was being replaced by fast singing. Ministers stopped having that regular meeting before a church service where they decide who's going to preach and whether there's church discipline to discuss at the end of the meeting. That was done away with. Higher education became acceptable. The Alcott Institute starts in 1895. Eventually, English replaces German. If you want to read about these ministers' meetings, Peyton Yoder wrote a book, Tradition and Transition. It's fascinating. It goes into great detail about all the back and forth conversations between these Amish ministers in the late 19th century. This is my final comment for today. I think there are vestiges of both the GCOM split and the Amish Mennonite and Amish split that are with us today. I grew up with very negative attitudes towards the Pennsylvania Dutch. My grandparents, that's all they spoke at home, Pennsylvania Dutch. My grandmother would sit on the phone at her farm and talk to Mrs. Mill, the reformed woman across the meadow in Pennsylvania Dutch. Lots of people who weren't Mennonites spoke the language, and it was part of the culture. My mother didn't learn Pennsylvania Dutch, and she always told me it was backward. It's part of our past. Let's get rid of that. We're modern, we're progressive. That Oberholzer old new issue, I think, is still with us in the Mennonite church. I've met lots of people who left the Amish church, and many of those have strong feelings about the backward nature of the Amish church. Now, I understand what they're saying. I don't always disagree with them. I couldn't be Amish myself. But there's a kind of negativism that's very strong in people who left that church. When I decided to do a doctoral dissertation on the Amish of Northern Indiana, I made a pilgrimage that most doctoral students did at the time to John A. Hostetler's home. John Hostetler wrote Amish Society. He actually was born and raised here in this community, was Amish as a child, left the Amish, became a scholar. He was the authority on the Amish until about the 80s when Don Crable took over. Anyway, I went to John Hostetler's home in Willow Grove, and we had a wonderful conversation about possibilities of doing the research I was going to do. And towards the end of the conversation, he looked at me and he said, "Mennonites are the worst people to study Amish." What? I didn't really understand what he was saying until I started teaching at Goshen College. And I'd talk about my research among the Amish, and there would always be some student who would come up to me afterwards and say, "You really don't know these people." And would proceed to tell me what's wrong with them, all the problems with them. Of course, Amish people have problems, like any other human group. Anyway, I think that those of us who've lived close to Amish communities and are Mennonite often have this negative feeling. It's there, it's part of the background. Okay, next time I'm going to start with the Russian Mennonite story and tell that story and get into the issues that eventually led to the creation of Mennonite Central Committee. We're out of time. Does anyone have anything to say about today's content? Comments, questions? Yeah. Okay? Anything else? Okay, well, next week is our last week, and we're going to get into the Russian Mennonite story, which is fascinating. Thank you.